I've been having a lot on my brain this book by Timothy Snyder. It's called On Tyranny, 20 Lessons from the 20th Century. And so it's 20 short little chapters about what are the sort of, warning signs, red flags. What are the things to look out for that are the warning signs of what we learn from history of when tyranny is a thing, authoritarianism is a thing, fascism is a thing. And let's learn a little bit from history and what are the lessons we learn. And lesson number 4, when listening to politicians, distinguish certain words. Look out for the expansive use of terrorism and extremism. Be alive to the fatal notions of exception and emergency. Be angry about the treacherous use of patriotic vocabulary.
Over 1 million Americans face sentencing every year, and it will be the most important day of their lives. But we don't fully understand the system, how broken it is, and what we can do to make it better. I'm Doug Passon. I'm a 25-year criminal defense lawyer and a sentencing expert. My goal is to bring more awareness, more fairness, and more humanity to the sentencing process. So, are you ready? Then let's get set for sentencing.
Hey everybody, Doug Passon coming to you from Studio 3553 in Scottsdale, Arizona. The date today, this is not an April Fool's joke, although it feels like every day is somewhat of an April Fool's joke lately, but it is April 1st, 2025, and here I am. You might have noticed I've been on a bit of hiatus, and I'm back, and of course I'm back with my great friend and esteemed colleague and brother, Mark Allenbaugh. Who else would I be with today to talk to you? Hi, Mark Allenbaugh.
Hey, Doug.
I'm happy to be back. It was a much needed break. And the question is, why were we on break? And I don't know if I have a good answer for it. I think, honestly, I'll be real. I think I've been totally overwhelmed with, the state of things that I just kind of shut down for a while. Like I really did want to kind of crawl into a hole, curl up into a ball in the fetal position and cry. And, I think that's by design. I think there's flood the zone with shit is a strategy. There's so many things going on that you don't even know where to start in terms of what to scream about and who to speak truth to, power, which power to speak our truth to. But thankfully, Mark has pulled me out of my shell and said, come on, you dumb fuck, it's time to get back in the saddle and ride this horse. He didn't say that, but I was reading between the lines. That's what he meant. And so there were two events today that finally just said, all right, we got to do this. And both of them are, right in our wheelhouse. And they involve this new indictment that comes down out of Colorado for the gentleman who is alleged to have firebombed or destroyed some of the Tesla facilities there, or some cars. We're going to talk about that because our esteemed Attorney General Pam Bondi has labeled him as a domestic terrorist. Mark and I just got through representing a client in a case in North Dakota where the government said domestic terrorism. So we're very intimately familiar with this and how wrong things can go when the government starts talking about domestic terrorism. And then and so we're going to talk about that. And we're going to talk about the announcement again today by Attorney General Bondi that she has directed the DOJ to pursue the death penalty against Mr. Mangione. What's his first name? I forget. Luis? No.
Luigi.
Luigi. How can I forget that? Luigi Mangione. And everybody knows who that is. That is the person alleged to have followed and killed the CEO of United Healthcare Group, the head of a major insurance company. And so he was charging the state, but then the feds got their hooks into them, and now they are saying they're pursuing the death penalty. What Pam Bondi said about the Tesla gentleman, whose name is Mark Allenbaugh. This is not Mark Allenbaugh. I was asking you to tell me.
Cooper Frederick. Yeah, Cooper Frederick.
Yeah. Mark Allenbaugh is not charged with any federal crimes yet, and nor am I. Cooper Frederick, sorry. Mr. Frederick is alleged to have done this, but not only does she label him as a domestic terrorist, she's saying we are pursuing, the DOJ is pursuing a 20-year prison sentence, no negotiation, I heard her say, and she gave a
Yeah.
speech, 20 years, no negotiation. And so we're going to talk about, what are the charges, what's he facing, this domestic terrorism. So that's really the underlying theme. And I think the episode's name has to be Reign of Terror, because in my estimation, that's what's happening here. That we're under a new regime, makes me long for the good old days of Jeff Sessions, don't you know?
God.
When there was at least such a thing as norms and maybe
Yeah. Yeah.
consideration of
Yeah.
ethics and old school, but it's a whole new ball game. So we're gonna
Yeah.
have to, and this is where we're going. So it's time to talk about this stuff, and more importantly, it's time to raise our voices and figure out what we can do about it peacefully, of course. And I also think that it is time for me to get back to my love of tequila, because all of this
Especially
stuff
now.
is making
Jesus.
me is not making me want to drink or need to drink, but definitely will it'll help us along in this conversation. So I was deciding which ones am I going to drink today, and I boiled it down to these two. Both of them are high proof blancos, which
Mm.
I'm loving the high proof blancos. And one is called Tequila Chamucos, and this is a 110 proof Diablo Blanco. White Devil, I think that means. So I don't know if we're doing,
Yes.
yeah, I don't know if we're doing themes here, and I don't know how White Devil would play into that. So I'm going to put the Chamucos to side. This is a Mijenta Special Edition Tequila Blanco, and here's what's cool about this, and why I think this is my first tequila for our talk today. What's cool about this is most agave plants are made from clones. In other words, they hack off a chunk of the plant and replant that to replenish their agave supply. This is, to my knowledge, one of the only tequilas on the market where they grew the agave from seeds. So just from the seed, and grew that plant to fruition. And as you know, because I've talked about it, an agave plant grown to full fruition is 8, 10, even 12 years. So
Yeah.
that's what's going into this juice. And I thought maybe the theme of planting a seed, watching it grow, and the fruits that it will bear might be somewhat apropos. And this is a really good Mijenta. If you guys want a tequila, any variation of Mijenta, very reasonably priced and super high quality. And for the women, because we know they're the ones getting a huge brunt of this nonsense that's happening. The master distiller here is, I believe her name's Anna Marie Romero, but I'll have to double check that. So this one goes out to the women.
Yeah.
Cheers.
Fighting Gilead.
Fighting Gilead, right? That could have been the alternate uh, title for our podcast.
Yeah.
Welcome to Gilead, motherfuckers. Oh my God, it smells so good. All right, so where do we start? Reign of Terror. I guess let's talk about the Tesla stuff first.
Okay. Let's talk about the Tesla stuff.
I've made it clear, if you take part in the wave of domestic terrorism against Tesla properties, we will find you, arrest you, and put you behind bars. Today, I'm proud to announce that the Department of Justice has unsealed federal charges against another Tesla attacker. We've charged Cooper Frederick in the firebombing of a Tesla dealership that occurred on March 7th in Loveland, Colorado. All of these cases are a serious threat to public safety. Therefore, there will be no negotiating. We are seeking 20 years in prison. The crime was committed in Colorado, and thanks to the great investigative work by the FBI, the defendant was arrested in Plano, Texas. Let this be a warning. You can run, but you cannot hide. Justice is coming.
The main offense conduct here is the count 2, 844, which is the federal arson statute. And then he's also charged with, unlawful possession of a firearm. But the real functional one here is that 844. And I think the stat max is 20 years on that 844 charge. And that's almost certainly what Bondi is going to argue at sentencing assuming he's convicted. I don't know if he's going to go to trial or not. She said no negotiation, no So, the good thing is still, at least as of today, who knows what tomorrow holds, sentencing isn't up to the government just
Right.
yet. It's up
Right.
to a federal judge.
Right.
So the judge assigned to this case will be the one ultimately
Yeah.
responsible for imposing
Well, let's
sentence.
break that down.
Yeah.
So as charged right now. That's a lot of
Yeah.
tough talk by the
Yes.
Attorney General, and at the end of the day, it's not her decision what the sentence is, unless there was a way for her to charge what we call mandatory minimum sentence that would be at
Right.
least that would force the judge to give at least 20 years. But this is not that on this indictment. And
Right.
but I did do a little homework. So the 841 actually has a mandatory minimum of at least 5 years and
Yeah.
more than 20. So
Yeah.
to the extent she could say 5 years and no negotiation, she might be right because the judge would not have the discretion to go below 5 years, except a couple of outside, really, really remote exceptions we don't need to go into today. So 5 years
Yeah.
could be the minimum. She's saying the max is 20, and that's what he's getting, no negotiation, and she doesn't have the power. Thank God she's
Right.
still, at least up today, like you said, she doesn't have the power. And I also wanted to tell the people kind of, I think this is a really bullshit indictment for a couple of reasons. Not because if he did something, he's alleged, he's innocent till proven guilty. Not because if he did do something that it's not wrong and it's not a crime, but because of the way they've sort of grasping for, they're trying to really shoehorn the conduct into some sort of appropriate federal statute. And I looked at the count one, and it's unlawful possession of a firearm. Okay, but we got to peel back the layers because the firearm they just say a destructive device,
Right.
and I assume that we're dealing with a Molotov cocktail because that's what I
Right.
think the
Yeah.
allegation is to burn the Teslas. But this is a regulatory. This is a very sort of, I don't want to say chicken shit count, but it is a regulatory offense. It's not even under the criminal code proper 18
Well,
years.
it does, but it does carry a criminal penalty.
It does. Yeah, oh
Yes.
no, it certainly does, but
Yeah.
you see this is a registration offense. So the crime here is not, oh, it was really bad that you had a destructive device.
Yeah.
The crime is, well, if you do have a destructive device, you have to register that with the federal government because some certain silencers or certain machine guns, you can possess them as long as you comply with this regulatory
Can you
requirement.
register a Molotov cocktail though?
I mean, if you can't, then how could you be charged with not registering it? I think you probably could. That is a
Uh,
ticky tack. Like, not that
yeah.
we're mad that you had this. We're the true violation under this statute is that you didn't register it with us. So that's kind of interesting to note for whatever
Yeah.
it's worth. There's no mandatory minimum. There's just a 10-year max on that.
Right. So that raises an interesting point though. If count one is a 10-year stat max, count two is a 20. Why isn't Bondi asking for 30 year or stating, bloviating, "Oh, we're going to go after 30 years"? Why 20?
Because she's super compassionate and doesn't think 30 is appropriate.
I think she doesn't know. I think she doesn't
Don't
realize either.
don't give her any ideas, dude.
What?
What do you mean? She
Well,
doesn't know that
somebody didn't tell her.
the judge
Somebody either
could run
didn't tell her
these
that 10 plus 20 equals 30,
30, yeah.
or that there's 10 years that goes along with the 5871 count with count one, that there's a 10-year stat max. So
So
again,
yeah,
I don't see why she would ask for 20 when she could ask for 30 when that's the stat max. Because I got the impression watching her little video that she wanted to ask for the max, that
yes,
we're going to go for the max and that's it.
right,
How
right.
dare you? How dare you piss off brother Elon here
Well,
and
here's
burn
an
his
alternative
vehicles?
theory. She
Okay.
knows that one carries a max of 20 and one carries a max of 10, but that
Yeah.
almost exclusively judges, when it's part of the same course of conduct, will run the sentences concurrently, meaning at the same time, which functionally means 20 would be the max because the 10 gets subsumed in the 20. And of course, that's the norm. We made the mistake of assuming the judges would follow that norm in our last case, and that didn't happen. So she
Yeah, well, that
probably
was an outlier case. That was an outlier.
it
So,
was an outlier case, but I'm
yeah.
worried that we're going to see a lot more of them as this reign of
I think
terror.
all these cases we're discussing today are outlier cases,
Uh-huh,
frankly.
uh-huh. So she
But
probably didn't realize that 30 is, and now you've just planted the seed. So now we know if Pam's listening to the podcast and she's going to come back out with a new statement going, I meant 30. And thank you, Mark Allenbaugh of sentencingstats.com for bringing that to my attention. I so appreciate you.
yeah,
And then
okay.
here's my other question for you, and you may have to do
Yeah,
some legal research on this, but count
yeah.
two. The reason, so he's charged with maliciously damaging, destroying by means of fire and explosive materials vehicles
Hmm.
used. This is what I want to focus on. Vehicles used in interstate or foreign commerce and in an activity used in interstate or foreign commerce. And as you know, this commerce clause is the thing that has been over abused, used and abused to create federal jurisdiction where none had existed before. So this is what makes this a federal crime is not the necessarily the destruction, but the fact of what you're destroying is something used in interstate or foreign commerce. And my question to you is, what isn't used or uh, you know, is this is a car, and
Yeah.
presumably a car will cross state lines, or probably did cross state lines to get to the dealership, and that is how they're making this a federal crime. And to me, that sounds like a stretch to make this federal.
Well,
And
that's how they get it's the same theory behind any wire fraud case.
okay,
Any
yes,
type of or child pornography, anytime you're using a computer or a telephone, that's how they get
yeah,
jurisdiction. Yeah, it does
but that's
does seem very
anything,
attenuate.
anything all the time. This commerce
Basically
clause,
anything all the time. Yeah. Getting federal jurisdiction is fairly easy.
yeah,
Yeah. Here's
research on
why,
that.
if I could just real quick,
Yeah,
Doug, I think I figured out why she's saying 20 years. And here, if you could see what I have on here, is the thing we're sick of talking about.
okay, the
The
terrorism.
terrorism adjustment.
Okay. Now, for the
So
people who aren't looking, though, you need to know we've now deviated from the federal statutes and we're into the sentencing guidelines, because nowhere in this indictment are you going to find the word terrorism. It's not there.
right,
And in order to, but Pam Bondi's been calling him a terrorist. So in
right,
order to really slap that label on him, they're going to have to rely on our good old friend, the sentencing guidelines. So
right, right.
that's
And
what you're talking
here's
about
a
here.
really interesting here's an interesting thing is there is no federal there is a federal crime of terrorism in terms of a definition, but there is not an actual statute that you could be charged with that is called a federal crime of terrorism. Rather, what you can get is what's called an upward adjustment under the sentencing guidelines.
Hmm.
It's just, in other words, terrorism is not an offense at the federal level like it is at many state levels. We'll talk about Mangione a little bit later, and he's charged at the state level, New York State, with terrorism.
Yeah.
That's different at the federal level. There is no terrorism offense at the federal level. It's strictly a sentencing factor, which means it's something for a judge, not a jury, to decide. And here, I think I understand why Pam Bondi was saying 20 years, even though there's a 30-year stat max, 30 years because of those two counts of conviction, count one and count two combined, you get 30 years. So here, the terrorism adjustment, the way it applies is if there's an offense that's a felony, and arson is a felony, that was intended to promote a federal crime of terrorism. So in a nutshell, so that what you have to decide as judge is whether the arson promoted a federal crime of terrorism. Now this opens up another can of worms. I'm going to try to make this as simple as possible, even though it's not simple at all. But a federal crime of terrorism, there's another statute you got to go look at that lists all these offenses that could constitute a federal crime of terrorism, and one of them is arson. But it's only a federal crime of terrorism if the offense was one of these listed offenses, such as arson, and it was committed with the intent of coercing or retaliating against government conduct. It has to be targeted toward government conduct. And so here, while arson is an enumerated offense, it's in that list of what could constitute, or it's an offense that could be eligible for this adjustment. The question goes to its motive. Did the defendant, what was his motive, to intimidate or coerce the federal government, or any government for that matter? And so the argument that I think Bondi is going to make, because on its face, they're going to say, look, he hates Elon Musk. He just doesn't want Elon Musk and da 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 da. And normally that would not constitute a federal crime of terrorism, because Elon Musk is not the federal government. Wait, I hear the ghost of Doji, or Dodgy, as they call it now. And I think that actually that's what she's going to argue. Even though Elon Musk is a private citizen, it's his conduct on behalf of the federal government, being Trump's basically shadow president,
right?
And the Dodgy entity that he runs, that's what's going to be the hook to say that this defendant, that's what it was. He was after the federal. The point of the arson wasn't against Elon Musk per se, but it was against the federal government and what it was allowing Elon Musk to do to the federal government. So therefore, what happens then? Well, if we look here again at this terrorism adjustment, it says to increase the offense level to a minimum of 32, and to also increase the criminal history category to 6, which is the maximum. So what does that mean in English? Well, we go look at the sentencing table here, and we go down to 32, because that's the minimum. This is the minimum. It could be even more, depending on other factors. That it could be higher, but the minimum, we're at 32, and we go all the way over here to the right-hand side at 6, 210 to 262 months, 40 months, or 240 months is about smack dab in the middle there. So that's why she's saying 20 years.
Now
so that tells me she is going to go after this.
Okay. Well, she's definitely, because she loves this word terrorism.
Yes.
And she's labeled him as a quote unquote domestic terrorist. And she's labeled everybody who's basically protesting Tesla as domestic terrorists, is the way I'm hearing this. And it's definitely the way I'm hearing Elon speak about it. But let me ask you then. So let's say, because they're now having to get inside of Mr. Frederick's mind and assess what his motivation was in his allegations, if he did what he did. And what would he be off the hook if he said, this wasn't aimed at Elon as government actor, this is aimed at Elon, the industrialist billionaire who's giving Nazi salutes and cozying up to German right-wing German fascist parties and doing terrible shit on Twitter. I just think Elon Musk is the scum of the earth. I hate him. I don't think much about what he's doing with Doge. It's not about government. Is he free of the label? No, I don't mean free. Sorry. Is he free of the terrorism in label? Any kind of terrorism?
If the judge believes him, he would be
Wait a minute. What about
wait, time out, because I know where you're going. He would be free of the terrorism adjustment if the judge believed him. This had nothing to do, this was not retaliation or focused on a government, any government, federal or otherwise. And if the judge believed him and said, like, this conduct was solely
based on Elon's douchebaggery.
Right. And it was basically retaliation against Elon as an individual. A big individual, a famous individual, but as an individual, then he is off the hook. But if the government comes back and the judge believes the government, there's an alternative argument. The government could say, look, okay, fine. This wasn't against the federal government. It was really against Elon and Tesla. All the employees of Tesla, that organization. Now there is an upward departure as opposed to this big upward adjustment, which bumps them up to offense level 32 and criminal history category 6, there's an upward departure, which could be anywhere from 1 month to the stat max, whatever the judge wants, based upon if it was aimed at the motive was to intimidate or coerce a civilian population. Now, that civilian population, is Tesla, the employees of Tesla, the sales staff of Tesla. Is that
people who buy Teslas? The people who drive Teslas and buy
Teslas. Yeah, I mean,
Tesla?
actually, arguably, yes. Everybody that's surrounded the other consumers of Tesla, the people who work for Tesla, etc. Those ostensibly could be argued as a civilian population. I mean, I would argue, like we argued in our case, that still doesn't constitute what the point of a civilian population was, which usually has to do with like a state, like the United States, the people of the United States, or the people of Colorado, not some private entity or consumers, or customers. Customers, this was the issue that we had in the Smith case, which we'll talk about later. But I would say that customers and employees of a private organization do not count as a civilian population. But to get back to the question as you asked it and as you framed it, his best argument would be to avoid either the upward adjustment or the upward departure. Say, no, this is focused exclusively on that douchebag, Elon Musk, that one guy. I hate him, and that's why I destroyed his Teslas and all that stuff. That's a symbolism that is symbolic of him. That's what I was saying. He's going to still he'll still be prosecuted for the arson. But I would, if the court were to believe that as I framed it, and the court framed it that way, he would not be eligible for either a terrorism departure, or the actual terrorism adjustment.
Well, that'll be interesting. And I also think that this is what we really have to acknowledge what's happening here, which is nobody should be going out and destroying property and burning shit down. There's great protests going on all over the country that are peaceful outside of Tesla dealerships. So if he did what he did, it's criminal conduct, but at its heart, this is destruction of property. It's criminal damage. It's vandalism. It's wrong, and there should be a consequence. But what is really happening here is, I think, again, going back to this idea of reign of terror, that the government is coming after these folks with every guns blazing, for lack of a better term. Why? Because they want to know. It's not about deterrence, I don't think, because nobody's ever going to be deterred. No one's deterred by the death penalty. The research is clear. Nobody's deterred by these harsh sentences. People are going to do what they're going to do, but it's to show you who's in charge and how much power we are willing to wield. And to make you afraid, very afraid. And that is exactly what's happening.
Well, that is a form of deterrence.
Well, I guess so.
But it's terrorism under another name.
What I think it is a form of vengeance, and I think it's a form of cruelty. And I don't know if it's deterrence. And I don't even know if they think it's deterrence, or if it's just we're going to be as cruel and vindictive as possible.
A show of power. I agree. It's a show of power.
It's the same reason they're throwing people in El Salvadorian prisons and wanted to throw people in Guantanamo. They may think there's a deterrent aspect to it, but it's cruel at its core. And I wanted to just say, if you listen to, I don't know what Pam Bondi thinks about this or her minions, but if you listen to Elon talk about this, he is not just indicting, and I'm putting that word in air quotes, the people that are physically doing the harm to his precious Teslas. He's indicting anyone who speaks ill of him.
It's not like the crazy guy that firebombs a Tesla dealership. It's the people pushing the propaganda that caused that guy to do it. Those are the real villains here. And we're going to go after them. And the president's made it clear, we're going to go after them. The ones providing the money, the ones pushing the lies and propaganda, we're going after them.
It's people that are pushing the lies and the propaganda. We're going after them. So it's anyone who speaks out against him
Right.
is the one that's the real evil, is what he said. Those are the true evil people. Then they're the ones responsible because they're motivating people like Mr. Frederick to allegedly do these things. And so if you talk about a real reign of terror, and I hope we don't get there, but I'm not sure we're that far away,
Yeah.
which is, you know, I don't know if you followed my Facebook thing where I made a big to-do about getting rid of my Tesla and why,
Yeah.
and even gave some quotes to the Huff Post. Like, so I guess I'm the real evil here
Yeah.
because exercised my First Amendment right. So we'll see. That could be a lot of like wacky Elon bluster, but I don't like it. And here's the other thing I don't
Right.
like, and then we can probably move on to Mangione. But I've been having a lot on my brain this book by Timothy Snyder,
Oh, yes. Yeah.
and it's a
On
small book
tyranny.
on tyranny, and I can't recommend it highly enough to anyone who hasn't read it. And it's a very small book, and it's 20 lessons. It's called On Tyranny, 20 lessons from the 20th century. And so it's 20 short little chapters about what are the sort of, warning signs, red flags. What are the things to look out for that are the warning signs of what we learn from history of when tyranny is a thing, authoritarianism is a thing, fascism is a thing. And let's learn a little bit from history and what are the lessons we learn. And lesson number 4, when listening to politicians, distinguish certain words. Look out for the expansive use of terrorism and extremism. Be alive to the fatal notions of exception and emergency. Be angry about the treacherous use of patriotic vocabulary. And so what we have here is a demonization of, Americans who are protesting. Again, there's a right way and a wrong way to protest.
Yeah.
But even the people that are peacefully protesting are being demonized and
Correct.
labeled as domestic terrorists. And it wasn't, people want to pay attention to history. It wasn't that long ago. 12 days before I was born, and I won't give you the date and the year, but it was Kent State massacre,
Yeah.
which was what? Students on a college campus peacefully protesting the Vietnam War, and Richard Nixon sends in the National Guard, and they open fire into a crowd of kids. And 4 dead in Ohio, Crosby, Stills, and Nash. You know the story. So
Yeah,
I
my
don't
my
think,
daughter goes to Kent State.
really,
Yeah.
yeah. Yeah. And so, those people were probably terrorists and minded Nixon and things like that. So we need to be aware of our history. And for
Right.
anyone who says, you're being a little bit reactionary or you're getting much ado about nothing, I don't think that's true. Now, let's talk about Luigi Mangione. Everybody knows he's the one allegedly who murdered the CEO of this healthcare. He was originally charged in the state of New York with a terrorism charge because
Right.
the state of New York has a terrorism charge that actually mirrors the language of the federal terrorism definition, at least.
Right.
But we don't have that charge in the federal state. So what's interesting now is Pam Bondi said, I guess New York either doesn't have the death penalty or they're just not seeking
They
it.
don't have the death penalty.
They don't
New York
have
does.
it.
Yeah. Yeah.
So when Trump got back in office, he did a bunch of executive orders, and one of them was to start killing people as much as you can with the federal death penalty. He was very upset that Biden cleared the row except for 3 people, and he wants to be able to murder people. And so he's directed the DOJ to pursue the death penalty as much as you can. And even when the states don't want it, you take it and you do it. And that's what happened here. So what's going on with Mangione?
Well, just first, the one thing that I'd like to address is those three people that Biden left on federal death row and why.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And this has to do with our theme of terrorism. What
Yeah.
constitutes terrorism and what doesn't? Now,
Yeah.
we've been arguing, for example, that what Mr. Cooper did there at the Tesla isn't arguably isn't terrorism. And I would argue that it is not terrorism. May have been stupid, may have been vandalism, may have been
Right.
extremely dangerous and unnecessary. It's certainly criminal,
Right.
but it wasn't terrorism. When we think of terrorism, the classic example that we always talk about is like Osama bin Laden
Yeah.
and, Al Qaeda and
Right.
from, 9/11. There are classic terrorism. Usually it's some type of, foreign agent, but we also have domestic terrorists too. And the classic example is Timothy McVeigh, who blew up the federal building,
Yeah.
in Oklahoma City, killed over
Right.
100 people and a lot of federal agents, et cetera, et cetera.
Murdered women and children,
Murdered women and children.
specifically because he was retaliating against the
Exactly. And
federal
that's what
government.
Osama bin
It's
Laden,
like by definition.
right. Osama bin Laden was retaliating against the United States government for
Yeah.
for its conduct in the Middle East. And so
Right.
was Timothy McVeigh, for the conduct involving Ruby Ridge and what happened down at Waco, Texas. So those are the classic examples. And I think they're almost universally agreed to constitute terrorism. Burning a Tesla lot, shooting up a power station in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of the night,
Yeah.
literally.
Right.
Those terror? No, nothing like what
Right.
Tim McVeigh did, and
Right. And for the listeners who haven't
yeah,
connected the dots, because we've alluded to the case
yeah,
that we worked on, and that was what happened. It was in North Dakota,
yeah,
and the allegation was that he took a gun and shot holes in a couple of power station transformers that were in the middle of nowhere, in the dead of night,
yeah,
unmanned, not a soul in sight.
yeah,
And the allegation was that this was a domestic terrorist because the motivation was alleged to have been his concern for the environment,
yeah,
and that they allege that that was conduct designed to coerce or intimidate a civilian population.
yeah,
Not super clear on who that population
right,
ever was, because a few people lost power, which people lose power all the time, and I
right,
don't think anyone's ever intimidated or coerced, let alone did they even know why they lost power. So there
correct,
was no civilian population. What there
right,
was a power company,
right,
and emphasis on the word power, because in
yeah,
North Dakota, the power companies, the energy companies, the oil companies, the pipelines, they have all the power up in that region. They dominate the politics and the power. Just
yeah,
like Elon Musk has
yeah.
all the power. Now, he
So
literally sits at the right hand of the president of the United States and has unfettered
literally,
access, literally, and has unfettered access to every single governmental
yeah,
agency. So there can be no greater definition of power. And the message is, if you
it's
fuck with power, we're going to burn you to the ground. It's lights out
correct.
for you.
Correct.
Sorry, but
So,
that's
let me just go back real quick to our three examples. So, Biden, before he left office, I can't remember exactly how many others, maybe 30 or so
yes.
individuals that were on federal death row. He commuted all of their sentences to life, except for three individuals.
Yeah.
Those individuals, one was the guy
Tree of
who
life.
shot up. I'm sorry.
Tree of life. The guy
Yeah,
who
Tree
shot
of
up the
Life in
synagogue.
Pittsburgh. He shot up a synagogue. He was attacking Jews. He hated
Yeah.
Jews. It was totally
Roof.
clearly terrorism.
Yeah.
Clearly terrorism. Then there
Yeah.
was Dylan Roof. He was a
Yeah.
guy
He
in
shot
South
up the
Carolina.
church.
Shot up a black church, a historically black church, because they were black. He was white. They were black. Clearly terrorism, and that he wanted to send a message. And then finally, there was the guy, the Boston Marathon
Oh,
bomber.
Tsarnaev. Yeah.
Yeah, Tsarnaev, and he
Yeah.
obviously again there he set off a couple of bombs. He and his brother. His
Yeah.
brother, was killed when they were apprehended, but he survived and he was sentenced to death because
Yeah.
people died as a result. I think at least one person died, but many people were maimed and injured. And
Right.
obviously, he wanted to send a message there as well too against the government. Clearly, all three of those were acts of terrorism. They were intended and
Yeah.
did cause death and injury to many, many, many people. And the targets were were not random. They were specifically selected, at least the areas they're specifically selected to try to maximize as much damage
Yeah.
as they possibly could. So clearly those were
Not
acts.
only, sorry to interrupt, but not only maximize damage, but maximize fear. You talk
Yeah,
about
exactly.
intimidation. This is a thing designed to keep us in fear.
There, yeah, and that's terrorism, to terrorize. All
Yeah.
three of these acts, just like Tim McVeigh,
Yeah.
just like 9/11,
Yeah.
were designed by their very nature to terrorize all of us, or at least certain subpopulations, whether they were Jews or
Hmm.
African Americans, or the people of Boston. Whatever it was that was meant to terrorize those people, and it did result, was intended to result in death and mayhem
Yeah.
and destruction. So now turning to Luigi Mangione. And for those who have been under a rock for the last several months, he was the individual who tracked down and shot Brian Thompson. This was basically a murder case involving just, I say but just one person, just
Yeah.
one victim with a gun. Yes, this happened in broad daylight, although I think it was really early in the morning, and it happened on a city street. So Mangione certainly put other people at risk. The bullets could have gone somewhere else, but his intent was just to kill, or at least maim, but he did kill one person and one person only, and it was a very specific person. This was a murder like just about every other murder that occurs in the United States every single day.
Yeah.
There was a victim that was picked out by the aggressor, the defendant, the criminal, went out, found this particular person, shot him dead because they wanted to kill him.
Yeah.
Now, whether that's an ex-husband, an ex-wife, somebody at work, or what have you, this happens every day. There was nothing particularly special about this case, except for two things. And one really wasn't even all that special. One was that Mangione crossed state lines to get there. And this is how the feds got jurisdiction. Because generally you don't get jurisdiction over a murder case. There is no federal jurisdiction just for murdering somebody. In order, if you're going to get federal jurisdiction, if you murder somebody, that somebody must either be a federal agent, or the murder has taken place on federal land, at a federal park or somewhere in Washington D.C. or
Indian country.
Indian country or something like where the land itself is federal jurisdiction. The murder has to take place there, and that's not in very many places. The United States is huge, and 99% of the United States is not on federal land. So, and 99% of the victims that are murdered, unfortunately, and there's a lot of murders here in the United States, they're not federal agents. They're not federal employees. They're just like the rest of us. There's just regular people doing their jobs, what have you. So there was nothing really special about that in this case, except for the fact that Mangione crossed state lines to track down Brian Thompson. And he specifically wanted to kill Brian Thompson. It's not really clear yet. I haven't followed the case that closely, but we do know that he specifically targeted Brian Thompson because he was the CEO of a very large insurance company, a health insurance company. And Mangione has had, like many people do, adverse feelings or ill will towards, or ill feelings towards the health insurance companies.
I don't know why that would be.
Exactly.
And again, let me be clear: never, ever, ever advocating for violence.
Right.
But the public seems to have some sort of empathy for what he's done.
That's a very good point. The public had a lot of empathy for what Mangione did, right or wrong. It's a little troubling because this there was so much. I think part of it, just quite frankly, was Mangione's a very handsome young man, and that tended to get a lot of.
Oh yeah, Ted Bundy was handsome too, but it didn't work out for him.
Ted Bundy.
Yeah.
You're right. Right.
but
So,
yes, but by the way,
but that
I
was the
did want to look
pre-internet
up
age.
I did want to look up United Health Group just in terms
Yeah.
of profits because it's supposed to be providing insurance for life-saving medical care. Revenues of $400 billion was what they
Jeez.
posted in 2024. So I think that has something to do with the public sentiment that these
Yeah.
companies, all of them, insurance, are making record profits. And the bigger problem is a lot of times that's about denying care. And you can look on the internet and see story after story after story about how these insurance companies have denied crucial care
Right.
that people have paid insurance premiums for and aren't getting the care, or they've been bankrupt and everything else. And it's a matter of life and death for a lot of people. And I think that has something to do, again, I'm not condoning what
Right.
he's done. And then, but the question is, I guess, is you're raising because you said this is murder happens, right?
Right.
And
Murder
it's
happens.
horrible. But let me just read you the opening sentence of the executive order where Trump is directing to pursue the federal death penalty more frequently. Since our nation's founding, the federal government and nearly every state has relied upon the death penalty as just punishment for the most egregious crimes. And it sounds like what you're saying is this this isn't, in your estimation, the most egregious crime because murder happens even premeditated and first degree
Yeah.
murder happens all the time.
Right. And I'm sorry, let me just add one other thing. Murder also happens to famous people, very famous people get murdered, and they're targeted by fans or disgruntled former employees or something like that. Happens, far too often in this country, but it happens. But it's not treated like terrorism,
Right.
and that's what Pam Bondi and Trump are doing here in this case. Is if you read the press release, it's kind of, and I have it up. Hopefully, you can see it here. But she uses an interesting little phrase down here in the middle of the press release. The murder was an act of political violence.
Mm.
The murder was an
Was an
act of
act of
political violence.
political.
So was Brian Thompson a politician? No.
Right. Right. Well, that begs the question, though: is this an act against a private entity, or is it an act designed to retaliate or intimidate or coerce the federal government? I mean, insurance companies are private,
They're private.
for-profit
They have nothing to do with the federal government. Yeah.
industries. Now, one
Yeah.
could argue, if I was going to put on my prosecutor's hat, that it's the federal government that can regulate them. Look at the Affordable Care Act that Barack Obama made supposed
Then
to do.
okay, then that
They're
theory,
inextricably interwoven.
okay, then on that theory, every time an employee of McDonald's is murdered, that has to be, by definition, a political act. Why? Because McDonald's is also regulated by the federal government. As a matter of fact, pretty much anybody that works is regulated. Pretty much anybody that exists in this country is regulated in some degree to some form by the federal government. We
Well,
all live under regulation.
and back to
Then
the Smith
every
case,
act, every
this was a
crime
private
becomes,
power, this was a private pipeline, private power company. But the judge said because the government regulates the power industry, that this is directed towards government to intimidate or coerce the government. So, yeah,
yeah.
and you could make a case
That's
that
why we're going to
anything.
win on appeal. But anyway,
Let's hope so. But the point is, okay, so everybody's okay, well then okay, but let's say, and you're going to tell me we can't even do terrorism under federal, which is really ironic because if you wanted to really slap the terrorist label on him, New York did it.
yes, New York
But
did
the
it.
feds say, well, we really just want to kill the motherfucker, and New York's not going to do that.
Right.
But they, some weird gymnastics, and I don't know how much we need to, how deep down the rabbit hole we need to go for this audience. But that terrorism enhancement that we spent time talking about for Mr. Tesla guy isn't going to
Doesn't
work.
apply here.
Doesn't apply here. So they couldn't get a terrorism. They don't need a terrorism enhancement, I guess,
Right.
for
They
a
don't need
murder
one
case.
anyway. Right. Yeah.
But they are so okay. We don't even need to go into it. But the point
Yeah.
of the matter is reign of terror. It's politically motivated, and
Right.
you have now, Mr. Mangione, you have fucked with power.
Yeah.
You
That's
have
what makes this
fucked with these
political is you have
billionaire
fucked with power.
CEOs,
Yeah. Yeah.
and we are going to make you, we're going to try to exact the ultimate or punishment for you because you have dared to fuck with the most powerful. If Luigi Mangione had killed a homeless man under the bridge on Central Avenue last night, or two of them, or three of them, we probably wouldn't know his
Because he
name
doesn't like the homeless.
because he
Because
doesn't
he
like the
doesn't like the
homeless,
homeless.
and he doesn't like the homeless. We wouldn't know his name.
Correct.
Now, I'm going to put on my prosecutor hat, though, because I guarantee you that every other CEO of every other major health insurance company is shaking in their boots right now and has private security details with them wherever they go. Because Luigi, again, presumption of innocence, but this case has struck fear in the hearts of those in this industry. And so, isn't that terrorism? To or would it be if the guideline for a civilian population applied here, would that count?
Well, so I see where you're going. I could I am sure a prosecutor would make the argument that the oligarchs of this country constitute a civilian population. By oligarchs, I'm talking about the other near billionaire CEOs of all the or billionaire CEOs of other healthcare organizations. That's not what a civilian population was meant to be. We go back to the legislative history and all this stuff. The wealthy are not the civilian population that was where that Congress was concerned about, at least originally. This Congress, who knows? They could go ahead and change the law or whatever, or clarify it. But I would argue that no, that just because the CEOs, a few dozen billionaire, multi-millionaire
Yeah,
CEOs are going around with the security details now. And who's to say they weren't before, by the way? So, a lot of the wealthy have security details just for ego,
right.
so, but, just, I just want our audience to be aware, though, how that terrorism now is being, as Tim Snyder noted on Tyranny, you got to watch out for this expansive use of the term terrorism.
All right.
Or I would add to that, anytime that crime, basically a regular crime, normal, I don't know if normal is the right word, but normal crime, all of a sudden gets ascribed the definition of political violence, and we start calling regular normal crime like murder political violence in situations where there's really no well-defined reason to do it, other than it's ad hoc, and Brian Thompson and some of his rich and wealthy buddies know somebody in the
Yeah.
Trump administration, and
Right.
they want the message to go out: don't fuck with us.
Right.
And so this is a really, I'm saying this I'm not saying this well, but what I'm trying to convey is the nomenclature here is dangerous. Talking about political violence when there is, at least on its face, not a hint of politics about this.
Yeah.
Yes, he went out and murdered this particular CEO,
Yeah.
but we don't have, that I'm aware of yet, some type of political manifesto. He wasn't part of some big political organization group
Yeah.
that was targeting or protesting against health insurance
Right.
companies, or any of that stuff.
Yeah.
There's not the imprimatur of traditional political will
Right.
behind this particular conduct. This
Right.
was just a murder. Maybe Brian Thompson owed him money. Maybe
Maybe
they were
his
lovers.
grandmother, maybe he denied his grandmother a heart
Yeah,
transplant, and
exactly.
his
Maybe
his
this was
grandma
something.
died because of the penny pinching, and he's just exacting revenge for this his grandma.
Right.
You
And
know?
one of the things, though, and just on that point, I do recall reading or hearing about that Mangione was denied some care for his back. He had been suffering back problems for years, some severe back problems with his spine, and he was not getting the care he needed
Yeah.
as a result of his
Right.
health insurance was getting denied.
Well,
So
and by
that
the
that
way,
that could be that.
that highlights the absurdity of the terrorism enhancement in general, which is we crawl in, we try to crawl in someone's head and determine their motivation. But is it really that much worse if somebody would have killed the CEO because they had a personal grudge against them versus
Right,
they think that the healthcare industry is doing major violence on a grand scale and they're mad just in general?
right.
It's like these power companies. We've seen their people destroy energy facilities for a variety of reasons. So one of the most popular reasons that people destroy energy facilities, which is a federal crime, the same crime that our client was charged with, was to
Yeah,
steal all the components, the copper
right.
wiring and all this stuff. So not only they're destroying it and committing a theft in the process, so it's a crime on top of a crime, but then the third crime is trafficking in stolen goods because their
Right,
goal is to sell this shit,
right,
copper, and get money for the copper. But
right.
yet those people would receive a sentence of, I don't know, 18 months
Months.
or
Yeah,
probation
months.
or
Yeah.
something because they didn't have an ideology attached to their crime. So now we're punishing ideology. We saw cases where somebody shut down a power facility so that they could shut down power to banks or convenience stores so they didn't have power so then they could go and rob them. And those people,
How is yeah, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I just how is bank robbery not a terrorism
they're
case
all FDIC
every
insured. Everyone is
single
government regulated.
time?
Right.
Every bank robbery should be characterized as terrorism, as political
Well,
violence.
guess what?
Every
If they
bank
could
robbery.
crawl in, well, I don't know about every, but if they could crawl into the mind of this particular bank robber and prove that they were mad at the fiscal policy of the federal government, and because the bank is
Yeah, it's
FDIC,
broke.
then
I
they'd
need
be
to
a
feed my
fucking terrorist,
kids.
right?
I
Then
need
they'd
to
be a
feed my
terrorist.
kids. I can't
Then
go out
they'd
and
be a
work, all this
terrorist,
other shit.
right? And this is what Timothy
Uh,
Snyder is getting
yeah,
at. This is the
yes.
way that the government keeps you in check. And the
Yeah.
government scares the body, the people, the
Yeah.
civilian. We are the civilian population that are meant to be terrorized and
Yeah.
intimidated and coerced into compliance by these decisions of the federal
Right.
government. And the only difference between this terrorism and that terrorism is what they're doing is purportedly legal. They're allowed to charge these crimes and use these enhancements, and obviously that's a significant distinction. But
Yeah.
the underlying motivation appears to be the same, and that
Yeah.
should be problematic to anyone. Now, can I
Right.
raise one other issue?
Yeah.
We can bring it back to Doge, the
I
douche,
prefer the politically correct term, dodgy.
dodgy. We can bring it back to these dodgy fuckers
Exactly.
who are dismantling government piece by piece.
Yeah.
What is the purported goal of Dodgy? To what? What is their supposed mission
Oh,
statement?
well, it's to weaken the United States so
Well,
Putin can
no,
take
no,
over a lot easier.
that's the that's that's the subtext, brother. I'm asking you
Oh,
what they claim the purported.
what they
What is the
claim.
stated?
Oh, yeah, to make it more efficient, make
Yes.
government more
Okay.
efficient. Yeah,
So
yeah.
let's talk about that.
Mhm.
And I don't know if people understand how much more expensive it is to pursue the death penalty in a case versus
A
not
very good point.
pursuing
Very
the
good point.
death penalty.
Yeah.
And so this case could be resolved with a plea to a life sentence. It could go away. Like they're going to charge him. They're going to allege a death penalty. They're going to leave no other option than to litigate this till the bitter end.
Hmm.
And if you go want to Google what it costs to litigate a death penalty, starting with the trial, pretrial level, the trial level, the appellate level, the post-conviction relief, let alone just the cost of housing someone on death row versus the cost of housing someone in the regular BOP.
Yeah.
You know, they I was trying to research this, and it's such a complicated analysis that it's very hard to nail down. But they said in some states, $30 million per
Mm.
execution case is a conservative
Jesus.
estimate. The average cost for a defense at trial in a federal death case is about 8 times that of a non-capital federal murder case.
Wow. Wow.
So it's like we
Wow.
want to cut costs and
Yeah.
be efficient unless it comes to fucking murdering you.
Yeah. Yeah.
Then the sky's the limit, baby. Then spend,
Right.
spend.
Right. And
So
also, just seeking the death penalty. I don't think most people realize how rare it is. And first of all, the death penalty is rarely carried out in the United States today, even though we have, I think, a few thousand nationwide, state and federal on
right,
death
all
row.
that money spent, and they don't even get the
Yeah,
result.
and they'll be on death row for sometimes decades. And now we only have three people. We have only three federal inmates,
Yeah,
on death row. We already talked about those cases. So this is very, very rare, very ad hoc, very arbitrary
yeah,
why they are going after Mangione
right.
for the death penalty. And I just want to add one other thing too. It's how they're getting to the death penalty too, because he's not, as we know, he is not charged with murder. He rather is charged with stalking. Stalking, you say? How does that get the death penalty? Well, I just this just I just want to go through this little exercise quick because it just emphasizes how arbitrary all this is, how politically motivated this prosecution is. When the irony is that it's not supposed to be
Politically
political at
motivated
all. It,
crime.
it's a
Politically
yeah.
motivated
They're
prosecution.
claiming an everyday crime, murder, is politically motivated simply because of who was shot. That's all it was. And I would say it would be politically motivated if it was like the president or some a member of
Oh, or if you were like just hypothetically stormed the Capitol to try to stop the certification of an
oh,
election, that
I
seems to
know, but
me to be somewhat politically motivated, but I
right,
don't know.
but
I don't
those
know.
offenses. But do you know what the statutory maximum penalty is for those offenses if you storm the Capitol and cause the death of a law enforcement officer? You know
10
what you get for
years.
that?
You get a pardon. You get a free fucking
Bingo. You
pass.
get a pardon.
You get a get out
So
of jail
yeah,
free card, baby.
yeah.
So
So
some politically motivated crimes are worthy of the death penalty, and other politically motivated crimes are worthy of zero punishment whatsoever.
right, right.
Okay,
So
got it, got it,
you
got it, got it.
kill. So yeah, just remember that you kill a cop defending the Capitol,
Or we
you
don't
get
even
a
need to kill a
pass.
cop. We can just beat a cop with like a flagpole or
Or to
something.
be it a cop or whatever, cause them permanent injuries and
Or
PTSD and all stuff.
take a shit on the floor of the Capitol and smear it on
Yeah,
the walls. Like
yeah,
we don't need to kill anybody. It's
right. But
free
if you,
pass.
yeah, but murder, you cause the death of somebody on the streets of New York who happens to
Yeah,
be very wealthy and well connected.
yeah,
Now you
right.
get the death penalty, which is rarely sought at the
Right.
federal level, and
Yeah.
for even the most egregious type of crimes, even much worse than
Right.
this. Very often the death penalty is sought, just life imprisonment. At any rate, so how did they get to the death penalty? He wasn't charged with murder. He couldn't be because the murder statute, you have to murder either a federal officer or federal employee, or it has to be on federal land. Neither is the case here, so that's why he was charged with murder. But what he was charged with was stalking, traveling in interstate commerce to basically he followed Brian Thompson, or travel across state lines to get to Brian Thompson, and he had a gun with him as well too. Because of that gun, they charged him with 924J. That's what allows them to get the death penalty. 924J, I had not known existed until now, because we don't do a lot of 924C cases,
Right.
let alone 924J. And 924C is a statute that gives you essentially mandatory minimums, but they're really mandatory consecutive sentences, that if you use a gun during the commission either of a crime of violence, which stalking is considered a crime of violence, or a drug trafficking offense, if you possess, brandish, or actually use a gun, you
Right.
get progressively higher
Right.
consecutive sentences.
5,
Now,
7, and 10 is my recollection.
and then 924J says if the offense, the violent offense, the stalking here resulted in effectively murder or essentially murder, now the stat max is death. So that's how, weaving through these statutes, is how
Yeah.
Bondi got to the death penalty, even though she didn't charge murder or terrorism for that matter, because again, there is no federal crime of terrorism. So now that's how we get to the death penalty. Rarely prosecuted. Death penalty is rare. First of all, the death penalty is rarely even sought. The government must file a notice of intention to seek the death penalty in death eligible cases. But death eligible cases are rarely charged. Even more rare is it that they will seek or file a notice of a death penalty. Most of those cases result in a plea to avoid the death penalty. There's a plea
Right.
agreement. The defendant
Right.
decides to plead guilty. So there is no death penalty then ultimately in those cases. But here, just kind of reading between the lines, I don't think, just like with Cooper in the Tesla case, I don't think the feds are going to negotiate here. There's not going to be any plea offer. They're going to basically force him to go to trial and force the issue of the death penalty. Now, just on that regard, so some of your listeners may not be aware of this, but at the federal level, and I think this is the same at the states now, ever since Apprendi and then Ring versus Arizona, old Supreme Court cases from the early 2000s, said that any facts that trigger the death penalty must be decided by a jury. So a jury must decide whether or not Mangione ultimately deserves the death penalty.
Yeah.
Bondi and her ilk can all go screaming about we're going to get the death penalty, but it ultimately is going to be up to a jury to decide whether he's eligible for the death penalty. And even then, the judge can veto the jury and say, yeah, I don't, thank you, but no.
Yeah.
I'm just going to impose life here. So really,
and this goes back
ultimately to the judge.
Yeah, and this goes back to what you were saying: is this is not the most egregious kind of case that warrants.
Right.
This is not the Tree of Life or the church shooting or the Sarnias bombing, and they're going to go through all this dance and the pomp and the circumstance and the sound and the fury about pursuing death against him. And at the end of the day, I'll make the prediction, I'm sure you'll agree with me, there's no fucking way that Mangione is going to receive the death penalty in this case.
No. This is not a death penalty case. This is not a terrorism case.
Right.
Even if there was a political motivation behind it, because not every political motivation constitutes a terrorism case.
Right.
Because I might be politically motivated, or I'll put it this way, then that makes every act of racism terrorism then. And it starts just expanding the term of terrorism to potentially apply to everything. And then what happens, and this is what by the way, the New York Court of Appeals has written in its jurisprudence regarding terrorism cases, that we have to be careful about expanding this definition too broadly, because then it loses its import.
If everything's terrorism, then nothing is
terrorism.
terrorism.
When everything's terrorism, then nothing's terrorism.
Right.
And that's where this is headed, by treating Mangione as a terrorist and saying that this is an act of political violence. It was not. He may have been trying to make a statement. He may have been rebelling against the man or the whole healthcare industry, and this was his frustration. He showed it in the wrong way. He did the wrong thing. He murdered an innocent guy, and he needs to, if in fact he's found guilty for this, he should serve some significant time. But we should not call this terrorism.
Right.
And one of the things too, just before I don't know if we're out of time, but we've been talking for a while. But I always like to show.
This may be a two-parter.
I always like showing stats. I want everybody.
Yes, you do.
And here, what I'm showing everybody is from fiscal year 2024. This was just released a few weeks ago by the U.S. Sentencing Commission, and it gives you the average and median sentences for major offense types over the last fiscal year for 2024. And what I have highlighted here is for murder. And we could see that the mean or the average sentence for murder was only 274 months. That's, just about 22, 23 years around there.
And just to put into context, Mr. Smith, the
Yeah.
guy who is alleged to have shot up two little power station transformers in the dead of night in the middle of nowhere with nobody around, got 25.
With no criminal history,
With no
zero
criminal
criminal
history. Who was on, by the way, on the autism spectrum and suffered from
Yes.
a bunch of other physical conditions, and is a 50-year-old
Yes.
man, essentially got death by
Yeah.
prison for
He got
this
25 years,
because
more
his
more than.
crime was
Yeah.
quote unquote politically motivated. He's been branded a terrorist
Yep.
by Judge Traynor and by the government, and now he's going to die in prison when the average sentence for murder is what now?
274 months.
Okay, so less than what this guy got.
Less than what he got. He got
Yeah.
300 months.
Yeah.
And I would just note that the average, way over here on the right-hand side, the average for murder in criminal history 6, what that means is this is a recidivist or a serial murderer. It was only 295 months. Still less than what Cameron got.
A serious multiple
Yeah.
murder. Super
Yeah.
super
And
duper.
so this is what the government, by the way, wants to give to the Tesla vandal. That's what I call him.
20.
The Tesla vandal is basically the same as if he had murdered somebody.
Yeah.
This also is obscene, because now it's showing that even sentencing lesser crimes as if they were as serious crimes, it waters down the seriousness of those crimes. It's almost to disrespect these other far more serious crimes, such as murder. Burning up a Tesla dealership is not the same as murder. Now, if somebody died there and that was the intent, sure, sentence them as a murder. But that's not what happened here.
Yeah, some property got damaged. Some precious property got damaged. So, okay. Right. And by the way, if you talk about respect, if we go back to 3553, which is the operative sentencing statute, one of the main tenets of that is, will this sentence promote respect for the law? And I submit that what Judge Traynor did, what Pam Bondi's trying to do with Mangione and this gentleman with the Tesla, will do nothing to promote respect. It will promote disrespect.
Yeah.
And if you think this is the way to deter,
it's vengeance.
Yeah, if you think vengeance and cruelty is the way to deter a future criminal conduct, I have a feeling you're sorely mistaken.
Well, it's not only is it vengeance, but it's just it's ad hoc. There is no rhyme or reason to it. It's just made up.
Right.
It's arbitrary. And to me, I mean, that is perhaps the worst thing that can happen at sentencing, is to have arbitrary sentencing, because that is the sign of a very sick criminal justice system. Is arbitrary
and there
sentencing.
will be some judges who still adhere to sentencing parity, treating similarly situated people similarly, right. And then there will be others. So you better check and see. I don't know, for example, if your judge is a Trump appointee, and there are some good judges who are appointed by Trump. I don't want to disparage all of them, but it just so happens that our judge in the Smith case was from the first Trump administration, and massive amounts of case examples of what are the average mean median sentences for exactly the same or much worse conduct.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
He threw it all out the window. He didn't care and imposed this egregious, cruel, and arbitrary sentence. And so I think that if you're a practitioner in the federal court, you need to know that we're in a new. This is a whole new ballgame, and that you hope that the judges are going to be the last sort of guardrail to massive amounts of injustice and cruelty and arbitrariness. And some judges will, and thank God for them, and thank God for the ones that are going to hold the line. But for the rest of them, you better watch out. and you better
Yeah.
realize what you're up against.
Right.
And if anything, when I look back on our case, I think we just didn't we either just didn't we did not appreciate the situation that we were the the waters that we were swimming in.
You mean the
I don't,
political situation?
yeah, the political situation.
Yeah.
Right? And
Yep.
if you're a practitioner, you better have a handle on that because things can go nutty fast. And
Yes.
that is why God invented tequila. And I will say, while we were doing this, I had the chamucos. I'm not as nearly as enamored with the Diablo Blanco as I am with the Mijento. So if anyone's listening, and
The
you're looking
Diablo
for,
Blanco, just a funny little story. Well, I don't know if it's a
it's
story,
a super
but
cool label, though. I don't know if you can see
yeah.
that.
So it's funny that they chose that because back, I'd say maybe in the 50s and 60s, maybe even earlier than that, 60s and prior, the Chinese would often refer to Westerners as young whitesa. Young whitesa means white foreign devil.
Uh-huh.
It's and so I don't know. Maybe I don't know. Maybe some Chinese person owns the white
Interesting.
devil label. That's really interesting. Yeah.
Interesting. Well, I have a feeling that both of us will be in an El Salvadorian prison in short order. So,
At least we'll know what good tequila to share with our fellow inmates.
yeah, I don't know if I can keister this whole bottle though. I don't. It's a big one, but mi gente, I wholly approve. Anna Maria Romero. Oh my God! So I hope this is the first of many
Yes.
podcasts that we'll do that will speak truth to power, and
Yep.
I want to offer my gratitude to you, Mark, for bringing me out from under my fetal position, under the covers, and saying it's time to get back in the saddle and ride this
Yep.
fucking horse.
That's what we're gonna do, man. That's what we're gonna do.
And so stay tuned, and we'll talk more.
Okay.
Thank
Very
you,
good.
brother. That's it for today, but before we go, I just wanted to take a moment and say thank you to you, the listener, for spending time with us today getting set for sentencing. Whether you're a lawyer, someone who could use the help, or maybe you're just a true crime buff who loves the inside scoop on how this whole thing works. If you're interested in knowing more about what I do, mitigation videos, case consults, live teaching, on-demand educational content, books, articles, all of it, please visit www.dougpassonlaw.com. I'm Doug Passon. Until next time, hang in there. Wait a minute, that's a stupid way to sign off on a podcast about sentencing. Hang in there. What's the matter with you, man? I guess they call that gallows humor. Sorry. All right. Well, I will see you next time on Set for Sentencing. Bye-bye.